When faced with an overwhelming, unstoppable threat, the human instinct is to run. Survival is wired into our biology. But occasionally, men choose differently. A last stand strips war down to its most brutal absolute. The mathematics of survival drop to zero. The battle is already lost. The only choice remaining is exactly how you are going to die. This dark calculation spans centuries. We see it in the mechanized slaughter of the Eastern Front in World War I, the fiery, grinding sieges of 16th century Europe, and the sun-scorched outposts of the Indian Northwest frontier. In each of these crucibles, doomed warriors decided that if they were going to fall, they would weaponize their final moments. They refused to quietly surrender, choosing instead to drag as many of their enemies into the grave with them as possible. By the late summer of 1915, the German army was pushing relentlessly into the Eastern Front. Their target was Osowiec Fortress, a vital railway choke point, defended by a severely outmatched garrison of just 900 Russian soldiers. The Germans had failed to take the fort through conventional bombardment, so they deployed a new, horrific tactic. At 4 a.m. on August 6th, they released a creeping wave of chlorine gas directly into the unmasked Russian trenches. When the toxic green mist made contact with the moisture in the defenders' lungs, it chemically reacted, turning into hydrochloric acid. The men were effectively dissolving from the inside out, collapsing in violent coughing fits as their lungs filled with blood amidst the ruined brick casemates of the fortress. An hour later, thousands of German soldiers donned their gas masks and casually marched toward the fortress walls. The bombardment had stopped. The air was dead quiet. They expected to step over corpses and claim an effortless victory. But as they neared the rubble, the corpses began to move. Around 60 Russian soldiers, coughing up pieces of their own dissolved lungs and bleeding from their eyes, dragged themselves to their feet. Clutching their rifles, these dying men leveled their bayonets and charged directly at the invading army. The invading infantrymen were utterly unprepared for the sight of dead men gurgling and running toward them. Panic ripped through the German lines. Thousands of men broke formation and fled in terror, trampling their own comrades and impaling themselves on barbed wire in a desperate scramble to escape. The German siege was called off entirely. The Russian garrison was already dead, but their vengeful spite turned their final agonizing moments into a weapon of sheer terror, holding Osowiec Fortress long enough for a strategic withdrawal weeks later. Let's look back to 1566. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent is marching an army of 100,000 Ottoman soldiers straight toward Vienna. But his path is blocked by a massive obstacle, a tiny Croatian garrison of 2,300 men led by Count Nikola Zrinski. This vintage illustration shows exactly why Szigetvár was a nightmare to attack. The fortress was spread across 3 separate islands, connected only by narrow bridges. To take the stronghold, the Ottomans had to capture the new town, cross a heavily defended bridge to the old town, and then cross yet another bridge to the central citadel. For over a month, Suleiman's massive army hurled itself at these defenses. The overwhelming numbers forced the defenders back, island by island. By early September, Zrinski's forces were reduced to just 600 exhausted men, trapped inside the burning walls of the final citadel. Suleiman's commanders offered Zrinski rule over all of Croatia if he would just surrender the fort. Zrinski ignored the letter. Instead, he gathered his remaining men, dragged a massive mortar to the front gate, blasted the Ottoman troops waiting on the bridge, and led a 600-man suicide charge straight into the enemy formation. They were met by a wall of gunfire. Zrinski was hit by 2 bullets in the opening seconds, slumping to the ground dead. His men continued to scream their battle cries, fighting fiercely until the Ottoman swarm swallowed them whole. With the defenders wiped out, the Ottoman soldiers flooded the open gates of the citadel, eager to loot the inner sanctum. They found a single, severely wounded soldier waiting for them. He held a lit torch. When the attackers rushed him, he dropped the torch into the fortress's central gunpowder reserve, instantly vaporizing 3,000 Ottoman soldiers. This final blast, coupled with the Sultan's secret death, left the Ottoman camp on the brink of total desertion. The surviving commanders, terrified that their exhausted army would dissolve if they stayed, abandoned the march to Vienna entirely. Zrinski's spiteful sacrifice had transformed a small detour into a psychological catastrophe for the empire. 300 years later, on the sun-scorched northwest frontier of India, the 36th Sikh Regiment of the British Indian Army garrisoned a tiny remote village outpost called Saragarhi. It was manned by just 21 soldiers. On the morning of September 12, 1897, a massive force of 10,000 Afghan tribesmen poured out of the mountains. They targeted Saragarhi specifically to sever the communication lines between the two major regional forts. This historical photograph demonstrates how that communication network operated. The soldiers used a heliograph, a system of mirrors catching the sunlight, to flash Morse code across the valleys. If Saragarhi fell, the entire region would go blind, leaving the two main forts uncoordinated and highly vulnerable. Led by Havildar Ishar Singh, the 21 men braced the wooden doors and prepared for the onslaught. The Afghan tribesmen rushed the walls in massive waves. The Sikhs, armed with bolt-action rifles, held them off for 6 grueling hours, shouting down repeated offers of wealth and safety with a constant barrage of bullets. Eventually, the attackers set the surrounding brush on fire, using the thick black smoke to obscure a breach in the outer wall. As tribesmen flooded the courtyard, ammunition ran out, reducing the conflict to brutal hand-to-hand combat. Ishar Singh ordered his remaining men to retreat to the inner walls, standing alone in the doorway and fighting the horde with his bayonet to buy them the precious seconds they needed to lock the gates. High above the slaughter, a lone soldier manned the signaling tower. He had been calmly transmitting updates to the neighboring fort throughout the entire 6-hour siege. As the inner gates shattered below him, he tapped out his last message, a polite request for permission to set down his signaling equipment and take up his rifle. The request was granted. He neatly packed away his heliograph, fixed his bayonet, and began firing into the swarming mass below. He killed 40 more attackers before the tribesmen finally set the tower ablaze. He burned alive at his post, shouting the Sikh battle cry into the dense smoke for everyone to hear. When reinforcements reclaimed the outpost the following day, they found the 21 Sikhs surrounded by over 600 dead tribesmen. This staggering lopsidedness drained the will of the Afghan force. Having spent so much blood and effort to kill just 21 men, the survivors were easily beaten back from the primary forts, their confidence in a quick victory completely shattered. If you judge these 3 battles strictly by the numbers on a military ledger, they were total failures. Every single fort was either destroyed or dismantled, and the defending forces were entirely annihilated. Zoom out to the macro level, and the reality shifts. The dead Russians secured a strategic withdrawal. The martyrs of Szigetvár stalled an empire. The 21 Sikhs at Saragarhi shielded an entire defensive network. These men utilized the tactical currency of time. When a defending force accepts that they cannot win, they can still choose to trade their lives for the clock. They weaponize their own inevitable deaths to buy the one resource an overwhelming army cannot conquer by force. Absolute defiance inflicts deep psychological damage on the invading force. A massive army marches with momentum, expecting an easy victory over a tiny opponent. When that opponent refuses to yield, grinding the advance to a bloody, fiery halt, it leaves the survivors exhausted, demoralized, and deeply terrified of the enemy's resolve. These warriors leave a legacy measured in the crushing, lingering cost of the victory. They prove that on the battlefield, the ultimate power is the courage to face certain death and force the conqueror to pay a price they can never recover.